Everything you own belongs to us now, Dad, my 34-year-old son Mark said, leaning across my dining table with a cold, triumphant grin. He slid a thick blue folder toward me, tapping his index finger on the top page. The family business, the lake property, the primary house, and all operating accounts. We had the emergency board vote 2 hours ago. You've been removed as managing partner. You're out. I sat in my favorite armchair at the head of the dark oak table, a table I had crafted with my own hands 35 years ago. I looked at Mark. His hair was slicked back, his designer suit sharp and unwrinkled. Next to him sat his wife, Vanessa, scrolling through her phone with a subtle, satisfied smirk, as if she were checking off items on a long-awaited shopping list. On my left sat my daughter, Sarah, looking down at her hands, her lower lip trembling slightly, refusing to meet my eyes. "Mark," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, keeping my breathing slow and steady, despite the sharp, icy agony tearing through my chest. "I built Miller & Sons precision tooling from a 2-man machine shop in a leaky garage into a $30 million manufacturing firm. I put you through business school. I gave you 40% of the operating equity when you married Vanessa. How can you look me in the eye and say everything belongs to you?" Mark smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. "Because you got old, Dad. You got sentimental. You refused to pivot to offshore supply chains. You refused to sell the northern acreage to the commercial developers. You're 68 years old, sitting on millions in stagnant capital while we do the actual heavy lifting. The power of attorney you signed after your heart scare last autumn gave us full authority to restructure the trust holdings. It's done, Dad. You have no voting power, no property titles, and no leverage. Tomorrow morning, security will pack up your office at the plant. You can stay in this house until the end of the month, but then we're listing it." "Sarah?" I turned to my daughter, my voice cracking slightly. "You agreed to this?" Sarah swallowed hard, her eyes glassing over with tears, but she didn't move to stop her brother. "Mark said it's the only way to protect the family's future, Dad," she mumbled softly, her voice hollow. "He said you were making emotional mistakes with the accounts." I looked at the three of them, the children I had raised alone after my wife Martha passed away 20 years ago. I remembered working 16-hour shifts, coming home with oil-stained hands and aching knees just to make sure Mark had the best hockey gear and Sarah had her piano lessons. I had poured my blood, sweat, and entire soul into building a legacy that would shield them from poverty forever. And now, standing in the home where they took their first steps, they were throwing me out like garbage. "You think you've covered every angle, don't you, Mark?" I asked, leaning back into my chair, resting my hands on the armrests. "We have," Vanessa chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she finally looked up from her phone. "The attorneys spent 3 weeks reviewing every corporate charter, property deed, and bank agreement connected to your name, Arthur. There isn't a single loophole left for you. You own nothing." I looked at Mark's smug, arrogant face. I saw no affection, no gratitude, no memory of the father who had carried him on his shoulders. All I saw was pure, unadulterated greed. "You forgot about one signed document, Mark," I said softly. Mark laughed, a short barking sound of total dismissive confidence. "Nice try, Dad. You're bluffing. You don't have anything left." To understand how my son ended up standing in my dining room, declaring me penniless and stripped of my own life's work, you have to understand the quiet, calculated trail of deceit that led to that night. 6 months earlier, my life was peaceful. Miller & Sons was thriving. We manufactured high-precision titanium parts for aerospace contractors. I spent my mornings on the factory floor, chatting with machinist technicians who'd worked beside me for 30 years, and my afternoons in my home workshop, building custom furniture. Then, in October, I suffered a mild cardiac arrhythmia. I was in the hospital for 3 days. It wasn't a heart attack, but it was a warning sign that age was catching up with me. The day I was discharged, Mark and Vanessa came to my house with a pot of soup and a binder full of legal paperwork. "Dad, this scare almost killed us," Mark had said, his voice filled with what felt like deep, loving concern. He sat on the edge of my bed, squeezing my hand tightly. "If something happens to you suddenly, the probate courts will freeze the company payroll. The workers won't get paid, and the estate taxes will destroy everything you built. We need to set up a temporary administrative power of attorney so Mark can handle routine corporate filings while you recover." I looked into my son's eyes and saw genuine worry, or at least that's what my loving heart wanted to see. I had raised Mark to be strong and ambitious. I thought his eagerness to handle the paperwork was a sign of maturity, a son stepping up to protect his aging father. "Are you sure this is just administrative, Mark?" I had asked, picking up my reading glasses. "Of course, Dad," Vanessa had chimed in quickly, pouring a cup of tea for me. "It just allows Mark to sign vendor contracts and manage corporate insurance renewals so you don't have to stress yourself with paperwork while your heart is healing." I trusted them. I signed the administrative authorization. It was the biggest mistake of my life. Or so Mark believed. Over the next 4 months, subtle shifts began happening at the plant. First, old Tom Vance, my head plant manager, who had been with me since 1992, came to my house on a Saturday afternoon looking deeply troubled. "Arthur," Tom said, sitting on my porch, holding a worn cap in his hands. "Mark is making changes behind your back. He canceled our supply contracts with American Steel and signed an exclusive deal with a shell importer out of Miami. The raw materials coming in are lower grade. When I brought it up to him, he told me to mind my business or he'd fire me on the spot." I was stunned. "He threatened to fire you, Tom?" "He said he has full administrative authority now," Tom said softly, looking at the floor. "He told the board you're stepping down permanently due to severe cognitive decline." A cold spike of fear shot through my chest. Cognitive decline? I was 68, but my mind was as sharp as ever. I spent my evenings calculating structural load tolerances for my carpentry projects. The next day, I drove to the plant. When I tried to swipe my key card at the front gate, the electronic scanner beeped red and locked the turnstile. Security guard Jim, a young man I had hired 2 years prior, looked at me with a pained expression through the window. "I'm sorry, Mr. Miller. Mark issued an order this morning. Your security clearance has been suspended pending an internal corporate restructuring." "Suspended?" I gasped, the air rushing out of my lungs. "Jim, I own this plant." "Mark showed us the power of attorney documents, sir," Jim whispered, looking around nervously. "He said you weren't well, that you were getting confused about company operations." I stood outside my own factory gates, surrounded by the hum of machinery I had bought, watching workers I had hired walk through the doors, completely barred from entering the building I had spent 40 years constructing. I drove straight to Mark's house in the wealthy suburbs. When I arrived, Mark wasn't there, but Vanessa answered the door in a silk robe. "Arthur, you shouldn't be driving in your condition. Mark told you to rest." "Vanessa, why am I locked out of my own plant? What is Mark doing with the supply contracts?" Vanessa's expression hardened, the warm, dutiful daughter-in-law routine vanishing completely. "Mark is saving this company from your outdated methods, Arthur. You're holding us back. We have massive expansion plans, and we can't let your stubbornness ruin our family's future. Go home and enjoy your retirement." "Where is Sarah?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Does my daughter know about this?" "Sarah knows what's best for her," Vanessa snapped, and closed the door in my face. I stood on the manicured front porch, feeling a sense of isolation so deep it felt like drowning. I drove back to my empty house, sat at my dining room table, and cried. I didn't cry because I was losing my business. I cried because I realized that the boy I had tucked into bed every night, the boy I had taught to fish, looked at me and saw nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. 2 days later, I received an anonymous phone call. "Arthur?" a hushed voice said over the line. It was my daughter, Sarah. She was breathing heavily as if hiding in a closet. "Sarah," I said, sitting up straight. "Sweetie, what is going on? Why is Mark doing this?" "Dad, listen to me," Sarah whispered frantically. "Mark and Vanessa are in trouble. Deep trouble. Vanessa's brother started an offshore crypto fund 3 years ago, and Mark invested $4 million of company capital into it using a secret credit line. The fund collapsed last month. They lost everything." My jaw dropped. $4 million of company money? "Yes," Sarah sobbed quietly. "The lenders are threatening to foreclose on the plant if Mark doesn't produce collateral by the end of the month. Mark and Vanessa aren't trying to expand the company, Dad. They're trying to sell the plant, sell your house, and sell the Northern Lakeland to a commercial liquidation group to cover the illegal loan before the federal auditors catch them." The truth hit me like a physical blow. They weren't taking over the company out of ambition or arrogance. They were drowning in massive illegal debt. They were systematically stripping away every asset I had built over 40 years to save Mark from going to federal prison, and they were willing to throw me onto the street to do it. "Sarah," I said, my voice steadying despite the horror in my chest, "why didn't you tell me this earlier?" "Mark threatened to cut me off, Dad," she wept. "He said if I helped you, he'd make sure I got nothing from Mom's estate trust. He said you were old anyway and didn't need the money. Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't know he was going to lock you out of the house." "Is he planning to sell my home, Sarah?" I asked softly. "He already signed a preliminary purchase agreement with a developer. They're holding a formal family board meeting at your house on Thursday evening to force you to sign the final property transfer. Mark said if you refuse, he'll use the power of attorney and the fake cognitive report from his friend, Dr. Evans, to declare you unfit in court." "I see," I said softly. "Dad, what are you going to do?" Sarah asked, terrified. "They have 3 high-powered corporate lawyers. You can't fight them alone." I looked out the window at my backyard, where the northern oak tree my late wife Martha had planted 30 years ago stood tall against the evening sky. "Don't worry, Sarah," I whispered. "Just come to the meeting on Thursday. And bring Mark." For the next 72 hours, I didn't panic. I didn't scream. I didn't call lawyers to launch a messy public civil lawsuit that would drag my family's name through the mud. Instead, I called an old friend, a man named David Miller, no relation, who had been my personal attorney and close confidant since 1985. David was 71, retired from active court practice, but possessed a mind like a steel trap. David came over to my house on Tuesday morning. We sat in my study, surrounded by dusty legal files, old photograph albums, and blueprinted corporate charters. "Arthur," David said, placing a pair of reading glasses on his nose, looking over the administrative power of attorney Mark had tricked me into signing. "This power of attorney is aggressive. Mark's lawyers frame it very clever. It grants him broad authority over your personal checking accounts and primary corporate voting stock. If we fight this in court, it will take 18 months of litigation. By that time, Mark will have liquidated the plant and transferred the cash offshore." "I don't want an 18-month court battle, David," I said, leaning forward. "I want this settled Thursday night, in this room." David looked at me, a subtle, curious smile touching his weathered lips. "You always were a meticulous craftsman, Arthur. Every machine you build had a manual override. Did you build one into this company?" I smiled back, a sad, quiet smile. "In 1994, David, when Martha was still alive and Mark was just 14 years old. Do you remember the Master Foundation Charter?" "Good Lord, Arthur, you didn't." "I did," I said, pulling a yellowed, faded velvet folder from the back of my floor safe. I loved my son, David, but I also knew that sudden wealth can corrupt a young man's heart if he hasn't bled for it. I signed it 32 years ago, notarized by the state Supreme Court clerk. Mark was too young to pay attention when he signed his secondary equity shares years later. He thought he knew every document in the corporate vault. David took the folder, opened it, and read through the 4 pages of dense, elegant legal script. As his eyes moved down the final page, a slow, profound grin spread across his face. "Arthur," David whispered, looking up at me with sheer admiration. "This isn't just an override. This is an absolute executioner's blade. Does Mark have any idea this exists?" "He forgot," I replied quietly. "Or maybe he never bothered to read the foundational files. He was too busy looking at current balance sheets." That brings us back to Thursday evening in my dining room. "You forgot about one signed document, Mark," I repeated, my voice calm, clear, and ringing through the silent house. Mark's dismissive laugh faded slightly as he looked at my calm demeanor. He expected me to be begging, weeping, or shouting in desperation. He didn't expect me to sit there like a grand master watching a novice walk directly into a checkmate. "What document, Dad?" Mark sneered, though a flicker of doubt flashed across his eyes. "We pulled every single paper from the county recorder's office and the corporate database. There is no other document." I didn't answer right away. I reached into my cardigan pocket, pulled out my reading glasses, and put them on. Then I tapped twice on the mahogany tabletop. The heavy front door of my house clicked open. Vanessa gasped, spinning around in her chair. Mark stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. Walking into the dining room was David, carrying a thick black leather briefcase, accompanied by a tall, stern-faced woman in a tailored dark suit. "Who the hell are you?" Mark barked, glaring at David. "This is a private family meeting. Get out of my father's house." "Actually, Mark," David said, stepping up to the table with steady, unhurried grace, "this is Mr. Arthur Miller's house, and I am his primary legal counsel. This is Ms. Rachel Vance, Chief Enforcement Officer for the State Financial Crimes Division." Vanessa's face instantly drained of all color. Her phone slipped out of her hand, clattering onto the table. "State Enforcement?" she stuttered, her voice squeaking. "Sit down, Mark," I said, my tone commandingly sharp, a tone I hadn't used since he was 16 years old. Mark hesitated, his jaw clenching, but the presence of the state official paralyzed his bravado. He slowly sank back into his chair, his hands trembling slightly. David opened his briefcase and laid a single, yellowed, gold-stamped document directly on top of Mark's slick blue folder. In 1994, when Miller & Sons Precision Tooling was formally restructured, Arthur Miller established the Miller Family Heritage Master Charter. Clause 14, subsection B, a clause signed and ratified by every secondary shareholder upon taking corporate equity. Mark stared at the document, his eyes darting frantically across the yellowed page. What is this? This is 30 years old. It's outdated." "A foundational charter never expires, Mark," David corrected him coldly. "Clause 14, subsection B explicitly states that if any secondary shareholder or appointed administrator attempts to pledge corporate assets, raw material contracts, or primary real estate as collateral for unauthorized personal debt or unapproved financial speculation, 2 things happen automatically." David leaned forward, placing his palms flat on the table. "First, any power of attorney, voting trust, or administrative authority granted to that shareholder is instantly rendered null, void, and legally fraudulent from the moment of execution." Mark's breathing grew ragged. No, that's impossible. I had the board vote." "The board vote was invalid because you held no legal voting stock at the time of the meeting, Mark," David continued ruthlessly. Second, under the master charter, any shareholder who commits an act of internal corporate fraud forfeits 50% of their equity back to the primary founder, and the remaining 50% is permanently transferred into an irrevocable trust managed exclusively by Sarah Miller. Sarah gasped, her head snapping up in shock. Me? Turned on his sister, his face twisted in sudden, hysterical rage. You conspired with him! You gave him the audit files! Shut up, Mark. I slammed my palm onto the wooden table. The loud crack echoed through the house like a gunshot. Silence fell instantly. Everyone in the room froze, staring at me. I stood up slowly, leaning over the table, looking down at my son. For the first time in his life, Mark saw the man who had built an empire from nothing, the unyielding, iron-willed man who had survived economic crashes, factory fires, and personal tragedy. You thought I was weak, Mark, my voice dripping with quiet, devastating authority. You thought because my heart fluttered and my hair turned silver that my mind had turned to mush. You thought you could take my home, take my plant, fire my loyal workers, and throw me into an institution just to cover up your pathetic criminal greed. Dad, Mark whimpered, his voice suddenly small, childlike and trembling. Dad, please, the crypto lenders, if I don't pay back the $4 million by Friday, they're going to prosecute me. I'm facing 10 years in prison. Then you should have thought about that before you signed illegal loans, I said coldly. Vanessa burst into hysterical tears, grabbing Mark's arm. Arthur, please, we have a family. Think of your grandchildren. You can't let Mark go to prison. I gave Mark everything a father could possibly give a son, I said, my voice thick with deep, aching sorrow. I gave him love, guidance, and education, and a multi-million-dollar legacy. But you wanted to strip away my dignity. You wanted to leave me with nothing. I turned to Ms. Vance, the state official. Ms. Vance, my attorney has provided you with the full audit records showing the unauthorized credit lines opened by Mark and Vanessa. I am formally filing charges for corporate fraud, elder financial abuse, and grand larceny. No, Dad, please! Mark fell out of his chair, dropping to his knees on the hardwood floor, reaching out to grab my trousers, his face wet with tears. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please don't do this. I'll give everything back. I'll resign. Just don't send me to prison. I looked down at my son kneeling at my feet. The sight didn't give me joy. It didn't bring me a sense of victory or satisfaction. It broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. A father never wants to see his child fall to his knees in disgrace, especially when that disgrace was built by his own hands. I loved you, Mark, I whispered softly, pulling my leg back from his grip, more than you will ever know. But actions have consequences. You chose greed over family. Now you must live with the choices you made. Ms. Vance stepped forward, pulling a pair of handcuffs from her belt. 2 uniformed sheriff deputies stepped through the front door, taking Mark by his arms and pulling him up off the floor. Vanessa sank to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably as the deputies led her husband away in restraints. The heavy front door clicked shut. Silence returned to the house. David quietly packed his briefcase, gave my shoulder a gentle, supportive squeeze, and walked out, leaving Sarah and me alone in the dining room. Sarah sat at the table, her head buried in her hands, weeping softly. Dad, I'm so sorry. I should have stopped him earlier. I was so scared. I walked around the long oak table, pulled up a chair beside my daughter, and put my arm around her shoulders, pulling her gently against my chest. You came forward when it mattered most, Sarah, I said softly, stroking her hair. You saved what was left of our family's honor. What's going to happen to the plant, Dad? She whispered, looking up at me with red, tear-stained eyes. Tomorrow morning, you and I are going to the plant, I said, giving her a small, comforting smile. We're going to unlock the gate. We're going to reinstate Tom Vance as head plant manager, and then I'm going to teach you how to run Miller & Sons the right way, with honesty, integrity, and respect for the people who built it. 3 months later, the dust had settled. Mark pled guilty to corporate fraud and elder financial exploitation. Through a plea bargain, he was sentenced to 4 years in a federal facility, while Vanessa received probation and community service for her involvement in falsifying the administrative documents. The offshore debts were liquidated through corporate insurance and the recovery of Mark's forfeited equity. The plant was thriving again. Sarah had taken over as executive vice president, sitting in the office next to me, learning every detail of the manufacturing business with dedication and humility. The workers had their pensions secured, Tom Vance was happily running the machine floor, and the low-grade steel contracts had been canceled. One quiet Sunday afternoon, I sat in my backyard workshop. The air was filled with the sweet, familiar smell of cedar shavings and furniture polish. The golden afternoon light poured through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I sat at my workbench, assembling a small oak rocking chair for Sarah's future children. I picked up a piece of fine sandpaper, smoothing down the curved armrest until it felt as soft as silk. My old hands were calloused, my knuckles slightly stiff from arthritis, but they were steady. I placed the sandpaper down, reached into my apron pocket, and pulled out an old framed photograph. It was taken 30 years ago at the lake cabin. In the photo, a young, laughing Mark was standing on my shoulders, splashing water, while the little Sarah was sitting on the dock, waving at the camera. I stared at my son's innocent, happy 7-year-old face. A single, quiet tear fell from my eye, landing on the glass frame. I didn't keep my home and my company through a clever legal trick or a sudden stroke of luck. I kept them because 40 years ago, I knew that building a legacy isn't just about making money. It's about protecting the truth, planning for the worst, and holding on to your integrity even when the people you love most lose theirs. I placed the photograph gently back onto my shelf, picked up my polishing cloth, and went back to work, listening to the quiet, steady rhythm of my own heartbeat filling the silent, peaceful room.